Okay, so transferred malice. It's a small consideration when we look at mens rea, effectively. And the picture in the middle sums up really what transferred malice is all about. What happens if the defendant, meaning to, in this case, punch the victim, but actually punches somebody else? Because technically, if we think about our equation, what that means is that the mens rea for that crime is to this victim here. So if this is the defendant and this is the victim, the mens rea is to that individual there. So the question is, what happens if the defendant ends up injuring this victim? Let's call him victim 2, for whom he doesn't have the mens rea. And that's known as transferred malice. And we're just going to take a very, very brief look at what transferred malice is and the 3 cases that define when it's applicable and when it's not. So our good starting point is to look at a definition. And the definition is relatively simple. It says transferred malice is where the mens rea of the crime directed at one person, I've just a spelling mistake there. Transferred malice is where the mens rea of the crime directed at one person is transferred to the unintended victim of the crime. So let's go back to our boxing. Transferred malice is where the mens rea of the crime directed at one person. So the mens rea, although this isn't a crime, quite obviously, I'm using it as an example. The mens rea is directed at the victim here, is transferred to the unintended victim of the crime, which in this case is the referee. All right. Now there are some times when it is applicable and can be used, and sometimes when it cannot. And we're just going to have a very brief look at doing at how we decide that. And we do that using 2 old cases and 1 new one. So we'll start off with R.V. Latimer. And R.V. Latimer is an 1886 case. And the defendant, in this case a soldier, it's always a soldier for some reason, but in this case a soldier, during an argument with another man in a pub, and it also always seems to happen in a pub, so the defendant, who's a soldier, has an argument with another man in a pub. He took off his belt, the soldier took off his belt, swung it at the intended victim, the man he had the argument with. It missed and wounded the landlady. So you've got the defendant swings the belt at intended victim. The mens rea is to hurt the intended victim. What happens is the belt hits the landlady, who's the unintended victim. He doesn't mean her to be the victim of his assault. But in this case, although the intention was to strike the intended victim, that is transferred to the unintended victim under the doctrine of transferred malice. Even though the result in some respect is an unintended one, he didn't intend this woman to be hurt, the actual intention is transferred under the doctrine of transferred malice. Okay, so let's just run over that quickly again. Latimer, soldier, has an argument with his intended victim. He removes his belt and swings it at the intended victim. It misses and ends up hitting the landlady of the pub. The landlady of the pub is injured. She is an unintended victim, but the mens rea is transferred from the intended victim to the landlady, and therefore the defendant has criminal liability. Now let's compare that very, very quickly with R.V. Pemberton, and that's a 1969 case. In an R.V. Pemberton, the defendant broke a window in a public house by picking up a stone and throwing it at a group of men that he'd been fighting with. He missed them and broke the window behind them. So the mens rea is to throw the stone and to hurt members of this group. They are the intended victims. What happens is the stone breaks the pub window. So the window forms the actus reus of the crime. Now, In this instance, there is no transferred malice. And the reason for that is that he could not have been convicted, or he cannot be convicted, if the outcome, in this case a broken window, is not the same as the intended outcome. So he intends to injure, or intends to commit an offence under what would be one of the Offences Against the Persons Act, but ends up committing an offence that is about criminal damage. Because the actus reus of those two crimes, the intended one and the unintended one, are different, you cannot transfer the malice. Okay, so in Latimer, you have very clearly transferred malice because the mens rea is for assault, the actual actus reus is also for assault. In Pemberton, the mens rea is for assault, but the actus reus ends up being for criminal damage. So the rule is in transferred malice, if the actus reus is the same, then the mens rea can be transferred. If the actus reus is different, then the mens rea cannot be transferred. Let's look at one final modern case, R.V. Mitchell, 1983. What happens is the defendant and another man became involved in a fight in a post office. The defendant, and let's call this man the defendant because he looks the gnarliest, that's the defendant, pushes his intended victim. But what happens, the intended victim falls onto an elderly lady. She sustains injuries from which she later dies. As you can see, this is post-death, quite obviously. This isn't in the post office. Now, his intention to assault his victim is transferred to the old lady who dies because the actus reus is one of violence and the actus reus here is one of violence, which means that the malice can be transferred. I hope that makes some form of sense. Transferred malice is relatively easy. It's straightforward and should just be considered where you have 2 or 3 people in a scenario and the intended victim isn't the person that ends up getting injured.